Welcome back, everyone. This lesson will focus on the Mexican-American involvement in World War II. It should be short. I could always talk a lot, so I can't promise you that, but I don't have too many slides, so hopefully it will be short. When it comes to Mexican-American involvement during this Great War, throughout history, we have been kind of left out in the narrative. Typically, we are represented in very negative ways. We just learned about the Pachucos, and this is the way Mexican Americans are represented during this particular event, particularly with the Zoot Suit riot. So Chicano historians have gone back and said, well, what was our participation? And one Chicano historian, Sal Castro, who was part of the Chicano movement, he has noted that Mexican Americans, in some shape or form, have always fought in every war in the United States, going back to he argued, going back to the American Revolution. So every war we've ever had, Mexican Americans have participated. Back then, obviously, we weren't Mexican, we were Spanish, but there was still participation. Because remember, many Spanish lived in the South and the Southwest. Spain used to own Louisiana at one time. So that's, too far back. For World War II, though, and really for the 1900s and forward, right, we have seen Mexican-American involvement in these great events. Back when I used to live in Santa Barbara, I used to go to a small town called Oxnard, California, and you would see a plaque to our service people, and you would see Latino last names on these walls during the different wars that we have. And it was so interesting to see Mexican-American names during World War I, kind of indicating that we also participated in that war effort too. But here we're going to focus on World War II. And you have to understand that participating in these conflicts, for many Mexican Americans, it signified this sense of acceptance, right? That, look, I am willing to die for this country, so I expect to be treated as a U.S. citizen. So there's a lot of symbolic representation when you participate in this event. And I'm going to show you some examples, particularly with Zeke, that Pachuco I interviewed, because he also participated in World War II. So let's begin. Typically, World War II is always known as a good war, in a way that it was this notion of Americans fighting for democracy for other people, right? America, we don't see ourselves as imperialists, right? We go to the world and defend the people that need our help. Now that's definitely debatable, right? Because we did take a few colonies here and there. A lot of islands, but in the American mindset, this is the way we see ourselves. I mean, it's just funny. But there's a book done back in the 1990s by Tom Brokaw. He's a news broadcaster for NBC, and he wrote a book called The Greatest Generation. And in this book, he kind of highlights American involvement, looking at specific people and even events that shaped that event. And when he mentions Mexican Americans, he mentions them in two ways. Number one was the Zoot Suit riot. And number two, which I'll talk about here, was as laborers, what was called the Bracero Program. So I'll talk about that because it does relate to this. And that's basically it, though. So we were either, just cheap labor, or we were delinquents, right? And during the Zoot Suit riot. So many Chicanos kind of took issue with that and said, let's look into this. And I know my mentor, he was one of them, Mario Garcia, who started to challenge that idea that we were more than just, out in the streets of Los Angeles or, picking fruit or something like that. So obviously World War II starts on December 7th, 1941, right? We have many people join the military. And for many Americans, they remember this is part of that Mexican-American generation, this generation that's trying to appeal to the masses, saying, look, we are Americans, and there's nothing more American than joining the military. right now we're having that debate with the accusations of our current president just slandering our military people who died during these events. And for many people, they find that insulting, right? Because they gave their life. Not only white Americans, but people of all different colors participated in this event. And part of it was this idea of, this is my country. Mexico's not my country, right? The United States is. So they follow that kind of ideology of LULAC, right? That politics of accommodation. If I fight and participate in this great event, hopefully I'll be treated as an equal. And we find historically is that Mexican Americans participated in large numbers. Now, numbers vary. I've seen them as high as 500,000 and as low as 350,000. Now, at that time, our population is a little bit over 3 million in the Southwest. So that just gives you an idea that a good portion of Mexican Americans did fight in this war, right? And it is noted by one historian that we were the most decorated ethnic minority in World War II. So there is a book at the beginning of this PowerPoint. You saw the picture, and that's part of a collection of essays that looks at Mexican American involvement in World War II in different ways. And the interview that I did on this person that I kind of call my grandpa, Ezequiel Oropesa, that Pachuco, he talked about his experience. He was in his, I think, either late teens or early 20s. And he had a family full of sisters. He was the only male. And, his parents, they live in LA, in the barrio. They're poor. And, around the neighborhood, some Mexican families were sending their kids back to Mexico to avoid, the draft at this time. But for him, his parents were here. His family was here. He's like, where am I going to go, right? So he talks about that experience. Some people, sent their kids to Mexico, but I thought to myself, what can I do, right? Everything's here. I got nowhere to go, but I was ready to go to war. And he actually fought in the Pacific. He was in the Philippines. It was funny when I interviewed him, which, this was a major aspect of the interview, was World War II, because that's what we wanted to find out. But, if you ever talk to people from the military, they don't like to talk about what they saw. So, he was very scant in regards to what he told me. And one interesting thing that he did mention was that Mexico was actually involved in World War II. We never hear about that. So, but they had an airplane squad called Escuadrón 201. And he said that, they kind of kept to themselves, partly because they didn't know English, but even as him being Mexican Americans, he didn't feel like he was welcome to them. So kind of showcasing that Mexican American mentality, right? That he doesn't get along too well with the Americans, and he obviously can't get along with the Mexicans. So he's a bit of a loner in this campaign to some extent. He talked about some of the, once he came back, about how people treated him. He, like we should, right? Treat our military people like heroes. But he got some jokes where he said, "Oh, why are you back?" From the community saying, we thought you were dead. Everybody from the barrio came over and congratulated me. They would tell me stories about some friends that had died. And it's just a reality of war, right? That, a lot of people fought in this event. And some people just didn't make it back. And some people obviously felt sad. And then he made this comment that some people would say that I should have died instead of their sons, because he was seen as a troublemaker. And some of his friends were really good kids. So just one of the experiences that he encounters at this time. There's another man, a book that my mentor wrote. His name was Bert Corona. I think I mentioned him in an earlier lecture. And he actually participated in the World War. I think he actually got let go. But he talks about his experience, particularly in the training camps where he faces a lot of discrimination, where he goes to different places like the Midwest, and for them it's the first time they encountered a Mexican American, so they use a lot of racial slurs against him. For women, We find Mexican American women. This is an interesting period because you have things like Rosie the Riveter, right? Particularly applied to white women, where white women get the opportunity to work in some of these military industries and make pretty good money. For Mexican American women, it's a little bit tongue in cheek to use that word, because what we find is that Mexican American women have always worked, right? Out of economic needs, that both father and mother, or whatever partner, have always had to work prior to World War II. So for them, using the word Rosita the Riveter or Rosie the Riveter, right, was a little bit tongue in cheek, because it's like, well, it's not our first time going into the workplace because we've always worked. And we find that for many Mexican American women, they did participate, just like other American women, through different clubs, kind of just gearing up for the war effort, sending troops goods right through the mail, things that they might need. So there was a club in Tucson called the Club de Madres y Esposas, because in their mind, that's their participation for the war effort, hoping that their partners would receive some of these goods, that they were in desperate need of. So yeah, the Rosita the Riveter, that idea of women going to the workplace. Some women, there's one source that I use in my Chicano Studies class where we see Mexican American women enter companies like Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin's a military kind of tech company, and they get to learn a lot of things like welding and what do you call it? Being electricianists and things like that. Things that probably they would have never done had it not been for this need of labor. So the war itself did create certain economic opportunities for women. The example that I used in my Chicano Studies class, I think she stays on for years because she becomes like a leader in that particular organization. However, she's like the exception to the rule. Latina women, especially Mexican American women, face a lot of discrimination. A lot of times they were the first ones fired when the men came back after World War II. So it wasn't perfect, but we did see their agency being used here because they did have opportunities that they didn't have before the war effort. During the war, we find for many Mexican Americans, again, this is a very tough situation, because they're doing their duty, right? Going to fight against fascism, against somebody who mistreats a certain population. Obviously, we probably all know the history of Jewish people, how they were treated in Germany. However, when they come home, for many of them, they feel like they're, why did we fight? Here we are in our suits and we're still being disrespected. And Zeke mentions an experience that he encountered where he was the only Mexican American at some of his camps. And, the Okies and Arkies would call him Spick, and he would often get in fights with them, even though they were all fighting in the same team, right? And it's not like he started it. It's these people who, use these kind of racial terms and have this hatred towards people of color. In the military, even though they're all fighting the same, against the same enemy. And probably one of the most significant stories to come out of this event is this one, Felix Longoria. There's actually a documentary that I recommend you watch because it's a very powerful documentary. There's actually a book too. So this comes from the book that I read. But Felix Longoria was a man from Texas. And he went to war and he got killed. So they bring the body back to Texas, and he wants to be buried in, at least his family wants him buried in a local cemetery. And the people who essentially run it say, we can't do that because this is an Anglo cemetery, and we feel that the community will be up in arms if we allow this to happen. And for many Mexican Americans, this is a slap in the face, right? Because here you are dying for your country, for freedom, and all that rhetoric that you've been taught from a very young age, yet you're being told you're not allowed here, right? I don't care that you fought for my freedom. I just stayed home doing nothing, right? And you went over there and fought and died. You cannot be buried here. And this caused an uproar in Texas where different organizations, particularly this one, the GI Forum, which is a Mexican American organization made up of vets, who took up this case and took it to the highest people. And what happens in this case is that they actually get Lyndon Johnson involved. Now, just to kind of quickly summarize Lyndon Johnson, he was our president during the after John F. Kennedy got killed. But Lyndon Johnson has a long history with Mexican Americans. Lyndon Johnson was a senator of Texas at this time. And he, before he became senator, back in the late 1920s, he was actually a teacher. And he talks about this experience that really kind of hit him in the face when he was teaching these small Mexican kids in I think it was like elementary school. He's like, these kids didn't understand me, I didn't understand them. But you notice the poverty that they come from, and that always stuck with him because he always felt he could do more, which actually translated into him helping in this particular case where Felix Longoria gets buried at the Arlington cemetery, which for military people it's a major honor, right? But this case really showcases the sense of racism in America, that even in death you cannot escape it, right? This poor man is dead, let him be buried wherever the heck he wants. But even then, the American population said no, you need to, you belong on your side of the tracks. Lucky for him, this had a happy ending, but we have to ask ourselves all those other stories that didn't, So it's an interesting story. Like I said, if there's a book called, I can't remember, I think it's like Felix Longoria case. It's been years since I read it. But again, there's a documentary on it too. But again, we see their agency. They're not sitting back just, oh, well, we can't do anything about it. Another example during World War II is the Bracero Program. Now, this program is interesting because the Bracero Program started off as a kind of labor event that brought in labor from Mexico to the United States. And here you see some of the documentation that Mexican migrants brought so they can work in the fields. Now, when it comes to Mexican labor, the United States has a long history with Mexican labor. Back between 1900 and 1920, you have all these kind of nativist groups trying to stop Mexican migration, but you have American companies saying no, let's open this border because we need this cheap labor, and they pay very little for it. So even though we have people who hate Mexicans, at the same time, they're like, well, we need them, right? So again, very contradictory, but there you go. So during World War II, because many people go to the military, including Mexican Americans, who some of them worked out in the fields, many U.S. corporations were in need of this labor. So the United States and Mexico developed a program called the Bracero Program. And if you know, the word brazo means arms. So, these people are working with their hands, right? So the program starts in July of 1942 and ends in 1964. Now, that's fairly interesting, right? Because this program was established to help during the war effort while the people were out there fighting in the military. And if history serves me correctly, World War II ended in 1945, correct? So why did it last so long? And you can only imagine why, right? So we see a lot of companies take advantage of this program. It was mostly in the agricultural field. That's where it really took its foothold. And they brought in Mexican labor. These are the actual laws. It was actually renewed and was called later Public Law 78 after World War II. But eventually it's just so cheap and affordable that other industrial centers, not agriculture, but industrial, like, companies that make things, not iPhones at this time, but, things like toasters or something like that, right? In the industrial or even textiles, particularly clothing, they begin to bring in cheap labor, some of this Mexican cheap labor, displacing American labor. And this kind of creates a rift between Mexican Americans, even Americans, but even in particular Mexican Americans, and this new immigrant labor, right? Because now, after the war, they have to come back, look for jobs. They're discriminated from going into certain industries, so now they're competing with Mexican cheap labor. And this is what kind of starts off that labor movement that Cesar Chavez started, right? So there's a connection there. Their working conditions were horrible. Here you see the passports that they kind of needed, the identity cards that they had. But then the living conditions for these braceros were horrible. They lived in squalor. Now, it was required for these companies to provide adequate housing and things like that, and they never did, And again, understand that when it comes to diseases and things like that, a lot of times we blame the people rather than, the companies who create this environment. So working conditions were horrible. Living conditions were really bad. And just give you a visual over here. There's a lot of documentation though. When they came over, they would spray them with some powder to kill, according to them, to kill the Mexican fleas. Again, insinuating that these people were dirty. And we find that, your average wage for many American workers was about $4 a day in the 1940s. But for many of these braceros who were working, in the cotton fields, particularly in places like Texas and California, and working down the fields, they made on average about $2.10. So they were getting paid about half of what an American laborer would make, during that era. About 100 pounds is what a person could pick in a day. So it just goes to show that it was almost half the labor that they paid. In addition, the companies were supposed to deduct, kind of like Social Security, deduct a certain amount from their paycheck and then send it to a bank in Mexico. So when the labor program ended, they would go back to Mexico and they would have this kind of Social Security program, right? Some money saved, so when they got older they can collect. But what happened was that the Mexican government and these Mexican banks actually kept the money, and there was a lawsuit not too long ago, well, I guess it is a long time ago, about 15 years ago, that addressed this issue and try to uncover where this money went to, right? Because many of these people, they just signed whatever because they just wanted to work, make money, and maybe go back home. But this is money that was stolen from them, and there's in the millions too. So this is it was a really kind of horrible experiment. As I said, it ended in 1964. So it just goes to show that this was so profitable for American companies that they extended it even after the war ended. So in conclusion, what do we learn? We find that Mexican American have participated in the war effort. I was in East LA. There's a place called Cinco Puntos where there's a little store there that sells masa for tamales. And anyways, it has a long line when tamales season comes around. So maybe you know of it. And I used to like going there, not so much for the tamales, for the masa, but just go there because they have food too. And they would have pictures of their family members that participated in the military, and some of these go back to World War II. So it was always cool just to look on the walls and some of these family pictures that, Mexican American participation in World War II, in Korea, and Vietnam, and the Gulf War back in 1990 over there in Iraq. So, we have always participated in American wars, yet we're still seen as second-class citizens, right? So this experience, you can understand how it creates a sense of inclusion. Like, yes, I'm going to fight for my country, but at the same time, when you come back and you're treated as a second-class citizen, it is a bit of a slap in the face. And that Felix Longoria case really showcases that, because even in death, you can't escape this racism. I mean, there's many examples of military people just being denied access to, stores and things like that. But that one is just so poignant because it's in death. Where, my God, don't disrespect your military people, right? This is a lesson that everybody can learn. Whether you're a president of the United States or just a U.S. citizen. And for many Mexican Americans, it really felt like America didn't hold up its end of the deal, right? Its democratic values that we kind of showcase the world, saying, look, we're the best country because we treat our citizens correctly. Yet the reality is quite different for people of color, whether you're African American, Asian American, and or Mexican American, right, or Native American. So it's not until the 80s and 90s where you begin to see these stories like, oh yeah, I know Native Americans were code talkers, right? Oh, I know African Americans participated in these different events. Oh, Mexican Americans, I thought they were just a bunch of thugs wearing zoot suits, right? So it's been up to us to come up with this history and kind of lay it out for them, saying, look, it's not just like one or two, 500,000. That's a huge number, right? It's not just 10 of us who went to this war. It's a lot. And this is part of the reason, again, why we have these classes and why they're so important, because it's, we have been such active members in these in American history, right? So it's important to note these narratives, so we can almost put a mirror in America's face and say, remember this. Remember when we helped out in this great event. We were there, right? It's not just white America. It's everybody. All right, so we'll stop it there. And I think next thing we talk about is the Chicano movement.